This is an overview of the HPI Cyber 10B, and as you can see, I've placed it next to the Tamiya DB-01 that I got for my wife. I made a separate review video for the DB-01, and of all the videos I've made so far, that DB-01 review is not very popular. I suspect because I was rather critical of the DB-01, but I think those criticisms are justified, and I'm going to try to highlight a little more about the differences between these two and why I think the Cyber 10B is so much better. So to start, both of them cost about the same. At least when the Cyber 10B was on the market, it has been discontinued. It was around $200, $220, somewhere around there. DB-01 is about the same cost. Okay, so same money for both chassis, but there are some pretty significant differences in the design, in the parts that make this chassis better than this. Okay, so we'll start with the obvious differences. The Cyber 10B is shaft-driven. This is belt-driven. You could go either way. No one is necessarily better than the other, per se. They're both good. My own personal preference is shaft drive. It's less maintenance. You don't have to worry about replacing belts or anything like that. A disadvantage that I will grant is that on this particular chassis, because it takes stick packs rather than saddle packs, the shaft drive has to be placed a little bit higher up to fit the battery underneath. And the shaft itself on the rear, it's kind of hard to see here on the camera, it is tilted back a little bit as it goes into the rear gearbox. So the results for this specific chassis is that not every type of stick pack will fit in here. I have stick packs that have the standard thickness around 23 millimeters. They can fit, but it's a tight fit, and the top of the battery casing rubs up against the drive shaft. So if you want something that'll fit without rubbing up against the drive shaft, you need something around 22 millimeters or less in terms of the thickness of that battery. So ProTech 5 amp hour stick packs fit just fine in here. There's no rubbing issues. Some of the lower capacity Turnigy Nanotech batteries, I have a 4.2 amp hour Turnigy stick pack. Fits just fine in here, no problem. But not every stick pack will fit in here, so you just have to be aware of that. Now, so that's a disadvantage of this that I will readily grant. But again, it's not a big deal. Some of the more glaring differences have to do with the shocks, the screws, and the suspension, or the suspension arms, rather. So if you watched my DB-01 review, you'll probably remember that I felt that the hinge pin design was overly complicated for the DB-01 because the suspension arm, mounts through a hinge pin, but on either end of the hinge pin you have these little ball ends that mount onto these ball cups on the chassis end and on the hinge pin brace end at the front or at the rear, and so that just makes it more complex. You have these extra parts that you have to put together to assemble the suspension, and especially for something that's a mid-level chassis, which is really meant for people who are not terribly experienced with RC, it just makes it unnecessarily complicated for them. It's pointless, especially when you have something like this, or even higher end chassis like the B44, very similar design. You just have the suspension arm goes, hinge pin goes through the arm, hinge pin pops into like a little hole on the chassis end, and then there's a hole at the hinge pin brace end, and you just cap it off with like a little screw, and then that's it. A lot simpler to mount and replace suspension arms on the Cyber 10B than it is on the DB-01, even though the same price point. Okay, so that's one thing. The shocks is another thing. I forgot to mention this in the review, and it's not a big deal, but the shock bodies on the DB-01 are not threaded, so you have to get actual shock clips and put them in there. Okay, plastic shock body, just like the Cyber 10B, but at least on the Cyber 10B they are threaded, so you can more finely adjust the spring preload on the Cyber 10B with the parts that come straight out of the box. As far as the screws go, the DB-01 uses Phillips head screws, and since the plastics on both of these are relatively hard, you can risk stripping the screw heads as you're trying to screw all the pieces together. So if you're going to build the DB-01, you definitely need to get a tap so you can pre-tap all the relevant screw holes before actually assembling the pieces together. Not too big a deal. You can still make it work. It just takes a little bit longer. And even when you pre-tap certain holes, sometimes it's still hard to put certain pieces together just because the head is a Phillips head. With a hex head screw, as is offered stock on the Cyber 10B, it's a lot easier to put parts together. You can put a lot more torque into the screw to tighten the screws down. Of course, you don't have to over tighten it, but sometimes even if you pre-thread a hole, as you get towards the end of the screw head, it starts to get really tight. And when you have a hex head screw, it just gets easier to completely screw in the screw. So this goes together easier just by virtue of the types of screws that are offered stock with the chassis. Okay. The other thing that's interesting about this is the motor here is mounted parallel to the center drive shaft, and the motor mount, this sort of gray silver bit here, is a cam type motor mount. So this is kind of cool because this comes stock with the chassis. On the B44.1, I believe that has a cam type mount. The B44 does not, and you can spend about $40 or so on a cam type mount for the B44. This comes stock with the chassis, and it's very simple. There's this little Lexan cover here. You just take that off. If you want to change your pinion gear, you just unscrew the pinion. It's right in there. And then you loosen up this screw. It loosens up the cam. You can twist the motor in or out to get the gear mesh to be what you want. Tighten the screw down, put the cover back on, you're ready to go. Real simple. On the DB-01, because it's belt drive, the motor is mounted transverse to the drivetrain. So if you want to get to the pinion gears, you got to take off this cover. It's at least 4 screws. And then if you want to take the motor out, you got to, or even just to adjust the gear mesh, you got to come in from this side and loosen up 2 screws. So it's a little more of an operation to, adjust how many, to change out the pinion gear is just the motor mesh on this chassis than it is on this. So it's a little easier to work on in terms of the suspension, in terms of the drivetrain, and just in terms of the type of screws that you have as well. The number of mounting points on the shock towers and the camber links is comparable, so you get about the same adjustability for both. So that's fine, but just working on this is easier. Okay, and that's the real point I want to drive home here. The other point I want to drive home is actually building this. So I talked about how in the other video the DB-01 has the screw bags are not labeled, even though in former or prior Tamiya chassis they had done that. I had built many Tamiya chassis, and this is the first one where I saw that they didn't have labeled screw bags. You can just rip everything apart and try to organize everything and beforehand and then build the chassis from there, especially since the manual draws out those screws to scale on the page. But it's just an inconvenience that I think is unnecessary for someone who, for the target market for these kinds of cars. These are mid-level chassis, so they're either for people who have some experience with RC, or maybe, you're a parent and you want to buy your kid something like this and they've never had an RC car before, and they're just going to be completely lost because they don't know how to put it together because nothing's labeled. On the Cyber 10B manual, I think this is very, very well put together. It's actually very similar to what you would see in team associated build manuals, where they stage the build in certain subsections. So they'll have, say, an A parts bag, and that will cover the first 4 steps, and then a B parts bag that covers the next 3 steps, and then a C parts bag, and so on and so forth. So instead of having separate screw bags and everything, you just put all the parts you need for a particular step or series of steps in one bag. Say, okay, I just need to open this bag. All the parts I need are in there, and it makes it a lot easier to put everything together. The build manual is very clearly illustrated. I think it's an excellent build manual. This chassis went together very nicely for me, so I like it. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to mention? One thing about the Cyber 10B, and it's probably easier if I just show it in the actual manual. I'm just trying to get this focused here. So this top chassis plate here, these two holes mount over the post for the steering belt crank, and you have to be careful how you screw these in. If you make them too tight, it'll actually bind up the steering belt crank. So that's just something to watch out for when you put this together. So I thought that was a little weird, that just mounting this top chassis piece can actually affect the relative freedom of movement of the steering. So don't over tighten these screws. Okay. The other thing, let's see, nothing else really pops out. I mean, it reminds me a lot of my B44 actually, just in terms of the layout and how it goes together. The parts quality is very nice. I do think it's very unfortunate that HPI discontinued this chassis, because for mid-level four-wheel drive chassis in the $200 or so price range, I think this is the best you can get. And this comes from someone who's built both this and other chassis as well. So, you know, this is not for nothing that I'm saying this. Tamiya has, I think, done made some improvements with their new DB-02. I took a brief look at the instruction manual for that, and I noticed that their suspension arm mount is more like what you get on the Cyber 10B and the B44. You don't have those stupid little ball cups in there, so that's good. But the problem with the DB-02 is that it's not $200. It's around $300. If you're going to spend that much money on a DB-02, you might as well just buy, you know, a proper racing chassis, because the DB-02 has the same components. It does not have carbon fiber shock towers. It has, you know, plastic or carbon composite ones. It's basically the same exact materials as you get in the DB-01. They just made it a shaft drive chassis rather than belt drive. And I don't see any reason why they would need to charge somewhere around $300+ for that. Doesn't make sense. So I still maintain that this is the best of them. And I've used this, you know, a ton of times. Works great. One generic criticism I would have of these kinds of chassis is that the stock bodies are relatively low profile. Okay, so on this chassis in particular, it's not too big of a deal because this is not a hot motor. This is just a Tamiya Sport Tune motor. It's low current draw, so it's not going to generate a lot of heat. So I don't need to, you know, cut any holes or anything. Although this body is pretty decent in that at least these regions here, you can cut venting holes if you want, and that should draw air directly to the motor. Okay, on the Cyber 10B, the body looks nice, but there are no clear like regions on the side where you can cut a venting hole to route air to the motor or to the speed control. And I tried cutting holes in the front windows to try to get some air in there, but it didn't seem to make a big difference. I presently run a Castle Creations Sidewinder with, I think it's the 5700 kV motor. I have a big fat heatsink on here. Okay, and to make that fit on the body, I had to cut a hole in the body, so the heatsink actually protrudes a little bit outside of the body. Even with that, and with relatively high gearing, so to keep the motor cool, the motor still runs at about 160 degrees. The Sidewinder speed control does not come with a fan, so it's going to run hot pretty much no matter what you do, unless you get a lot of airflow to it. It runs at about 190 degrees in this chassis. It's actually too hot. So I have to try to find a way to fit a fan in there while also fitting the body on it, because the fan's going to run up against the body here. So that's a challenge. But I hope you found this to be at least a more informative comparison between these two chassis, and that this better explains why I like this chassis so much, certainly for mid-range four-wheel drive 10-scale buggies. It's a shame that HPI discontinued it. The aftermarket parts like the titanium turnbuckles, the aluminum shocks, slipper clutch, they can be hard to find now. Especially the shocks, they're completely sold out everywhere as far as I can tell. But that's it.